I refer to Labor's new family car and Ute Tax.
They love taxes. And there's no shortage of taxes that they've introduced. And today we debate on their latest tax, a tax on the family car and the tradies' ute.
People just can't afford in their budgets to find another $14,000 or $18,000 under Mr Albanese's new Ute tax and new family car tax.
Why does this Labor government want to punish Aussie families and tradies for their choices?
One thing the federal opposition is really good at is a snappy slogan that attacks a Labor policy.
The most compassionate thing you can do is stop the boats.
The one thing I say to all Australians is this: if you don't know how the voice is going to work, vote no.
All the debt and deficit that can be expected from Labor only covered up by clever accounting and a great big new tax on mining.
The latest is Ute Tax. That's how Peter Dutton and the opposition have been describing a plan by Labor to dramatically change the fleet of vehicles on our roads. The idea is this: car manufacturers have to lower the carbon intensity of their Australian fleets by more than 60% by 2030 or face fines. It's a way to encourage manufacturers like Ford, Toyota and Hyundai to sell more electric vehicles and hybrids. The effect, the government hopes, will be to eventually make it more difficult to buy a petrol car, contributing to its overall goal of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. Back in 2019, Scott Morrison said electric vehicles didn't have enough range and there weren't enough charging stations to make the whole idea work.
I'll tell you what, it's not going to tow your trailer, it's not going to tow your boat, it's not going to get you out to your favourite camping spot with your family. Bill Shorten wants to end the weekend when it comes to his policy on electric vehicles.
The Australian's chief political correspondent is Jeff Chambers. Jeff drives a petrol car, but he's got two brothers with Teslas. Do they talk about having trouble finding somewhere to charge them up?
One of them charges at home, he's in Perth, and the other one is in an apartment complex. So he has to go hunting around shopping complexes and other places to find somewhere that he can charge and watch Netflix at the same time.
This is the challenge about EVs, isn't it? Some people out there in the community are concerned that they're not going to be easy to charge up, certainly not as easy as just pulling into the petrol station. It's a challenge for Labor.
Oh, it's a huge challenge, and we're a very big country, and for some people, particularly in regional centres, have to travel great distances just to do day-to-day life chores. So, we've seen even in places that have embraced EV technology, like California, huge lineups to access charging stations. And there's a long-term argument that your traditional petrol station over time will end up being converted into a charging station, and there's a whole bunch of complex things like road user charges instead of fuel excise that this government or future governments will have to address.
Peter Dutton's been calling this a Ute tax because the kinds of vehicles tradies use, utes and vans, typically have higher emissions than a regular car, and manufacturers will be required to bring those emissions down dramatically. And now the government's taking a step back. The government says it has always intended to listen to feedback from the industry and the nations that manufacture cars for the Australian market, including Thailand and Japan.
So in early February, Catherine King and Chris Bowen announced Labor's preferred model for a new vehicle efficiency standard. You'll recall that some years ago, I think it was Paul Fletcher and Josh Frydenberg at the time, had dipped their toe into considering a similar policy and then obviously copped a fair bit of backlash. So under the government's preferred model, car makers would have to bring down the average carbon output of their stock sold in Australia, and Labor's goal is to achieve a 60% reduction in average new car emissions by 2029. This would effectively mean that companies like Ford, Hyundai, Mazda, Nissan and others would progressively have to sell more electric cars and hybrids into Australia to offset emissions from their petrol fleet, which would effectively make it harder to buy a new petrol car over time. Now, there would be some form of a credit trading system under that standard. So suppliers who beat the targets are able to trade credits with those who fall short, and car makers would face fines of around $100 per gram of carbon over which their fleet exceeds the threshold. Now, a company like Toyota that has those smaller fuel-efficient vehicles like Corollas and such, they would find it easier to offset those bigger cars because they've got a bigger, smaller car fleet. A company like Isuzu that almost exclusively trades in those heavier, light commercial vehicles, under the preferred model, they would more than likely not be able to trade here in Australia.
There are some fractures at the highest levels of government here in Australia. What are some ministers concerned about?
Well, Labor have talked a big talk around emissions reduction. They've got a 2030 target. By the end of this year, they will land on a 2035 target. And you would imagine that they will take that 2035 target to COP. That's the United Nations Climate Change Conference. And they will use that to try and swing support behind a joint Australia-South Pacific United Nations Climate Change Conference to be held in a few years' time. So you've got also net zero by 2050, and transport emissions obviously play a big role in all of that, but it's also political kryptonite in the fact that Australians love their certain types of utes and four-wheel drives and SUVs, and if there's any major impact on your choice and most importantly the price, that could be politically damaging for Labor.
So why back down now? Labor thought it had a bit of cover on this idea because President Joe Biden in the US had a similar plan with tough new standards for emissions that his rival Donald Trump said were bad for the US car industry.
Great state of Michigan is going to tell crooked Joe Biden, you're fired, get the hell out.
But in recent days, Biden has wavered. He's dramatically slowed down the introduction of the new rules.
It's a delicate balancing act for Biden. The road to his re-election goes through Michigan. The United Auto Workers, which has endorsed Biden, called the revised proposal a more feasible emissions rule that protects workers.
And last month, I revealed, after Chris Bowen and Anthony Albanese had told Australians to look at movies and TV shows where you see those massive pickup trucks and utes, that their plan would be exactly the same. Now, we learned that was not true because the EPA in the US actually carves out certain vehicles over a certain weight, hence why you've got those massive trucks in America. Last week, which was quite a major development, the Biden administration made a couple of announcements where they've softened their rules because there was a big pushback from car manufacturers in relation to the reality of being able to hit these very ambitious targets.
Coming up, how Labor's hardheads have been negotiating behind the scenes. While I've got you, we'd love you to get more of this journalism by subscribing to The Australian. Our subscribers get breaking news alerts direct to their phones, newsletters, special events, and the most lively and detailed news, analysis and commentary 24/7. Check us out at theaustralian.com.au, and we'll be back after this break. When governments introduce a big new policy, they engage with stakeholders in rounds of negotiation. Those can be pretty bruising. And in this case, there are claims the government's been particularly hard-headed. There's been some disquiet about the tactics that the government has been using here. What's been going on?
So increasingly, and this is a big move away from what Kevin Rudd and his government tried to do. So that was Kevin Rudd and John Faulkner when they made a big virtue of trying to make government more transparent and open. Under the Rudd government, they moved to limit the use of non-disclosure agreements and basically use NDAs only around two areas, which was national security and commercial in confidence matters. What we've seen through industrial relations negotiations with pharmacists, miners and gas companies around the PRRT, even with faith leaders on proposed religious freedoms laws, is this demand from the government that people sign NDAs, that they keep their phones outside of meetings. And that's basically intended to ensure that groups or industry representatives cannot discuss the substance of what happens behind closed doors, which sort of undermines the Albanese government's attempt to champion themselves as the bastion of integrity and transparency. So we're seeing this happen across the board. And those that do speak out critically of government policies are being threatened that they will be frozen out of processes. And we've already seen this. I wrote a story last year where the Master Builders Association were banned by Tony Burke from a key meeting. And even last Thursday, in relation to the new vehicle efficiency standard, we saw the Peak Automotive Manufacturing Group excluded, and we saw the Peak Motoring Consumer Group, the AAA, also excluded. So it's sort of a hand-picking of select groups that will either not speak out publicly or who won't criticise the government.
Jeff Chambers is The Australian's chief political correspondent. Thanks for joining us on The Front. And you can read all our journalism for a lot less than a litre of petrol a day right now at theaustralian.com.au.